Welcome back. Methods in Python are very powerful. There are a variety of things that you can pass to them. In this specific step, let's focus on understanding all the different things that you can pass to a method. Normal arguments, default arguments, variable arguments, and keyword arguments. Let's create a very simple method. I'll call this example method. We would want to define a method, so let's start with def. And to this, we'll have different kinds of parameters. The first one I would call mandatory parameter. The second one, I'll say it's default parameter. And the value I would give it is default. For parameters, you can assign default values in Python. So that's what we are using in here. Default parameter is equal to default. So if this parameter is not passed, the default value will be default. The third one is something called variable parameters. So variable parameters, variable arguments. So what I'll do is I'll say it's a variable parameter, but the important thing is the star before it. So I'm putting a star before it. We'll see what it means a little later. The last one is called keyword arguments. And let's put a double star before this. Typically, instead of the variable parameter, these are also called args. So I'll say star args. So we have star args, star keyword args, and we have a mandatory parameter and a default parameter defined. And all that we do in this method is very simple. We'll print all the values out. So I'll say I'll use a formatted string and print each value. So mandatory parameter and the value of the mandatory parameter. Let's use a triple quote so that we can actually print the string as is. So triple quote is very similar to double quote, except that with triple quote you can split your text over multiple lines. So I can do something of this kind. Mandatory parameter is equal to this and things like this. So the string can be split over multiple lines if you use triple quote. What I'm doing now is I'm actually printing out all the values that are passed in. Cool, isn't it? Now, we have a simple method. Let's look at how I can call this method. The idea behind this video is to understand all these things which are being passed in. How can you call this method and what gets passed to this method when it's called in different ways. So let's get started with the basic way of calling this, right? Example method. There's a mandatory parameter and all the other ones. This is a default parameter and this is variable arguments and this is keyword arguments. What would happen if I just say example method? What do you think will be the output? Run. It says missing one required positional argument. The thing is, this one is something called a positional argument. The mandatory parameter is a positional argument because this does not have a value. So you should definitely pass a value to it. So you can see that it's giving a compilation error. Now, let's say I would want to call this with a value for that. The way I can pass a value to this mandatory parameter is by saying, let's say 15. What does it do? You can see what are the values that are being passed in. So the mandatory parameter is getting a value of 15. The default parameter, because we did not pass any value in it, it's getting a value of default. The args is an empty. One of the things you can already see is args is a tuple. So that's why it's represented with parenthesis. And you can see that the keyword arguments is empty as well. And you can see that this is a dictionary because it's shown with a curly braces. There is another way you can do exactly the same thing. How can I do that? The other way is to use the name of the parameter. I can say mandatory parameter is equal to 15 and what would happen is exactly the same. There's no change. It exactly is the same. So in Python, you can also use name of the parameter to set a value to it when you are calling it. This is called named parameters or named arguments. Let's now look at other ways of calling this method. Let's comment this out and let's call this now example method. And let's say I'm passing in 25, comma, I'm passing in 45. What would happen? You can see that the mandatory parameter is 25. The default parameter is 45, so it's not using the default anymore. It's using 45. Args is this and keyword arguments is this. One of the important things is Python does not really worry about the type. You can see that the default value is of a different type and the value I'm passing in is of a different type. Python does not worry about it at all. It does not worry. Unless you are doing something specific, calling a method of that specific type, the execution would be continuing without a problem. So over here we are able to pass in 45, or you'd be able to even pass in a string. So I can say some string and run it without a problem. So you can see default parameter is some string. Now let's get to the interesting part, right? So we want to see what's getting passed to args, keyword args. So I'm getting this a call with 25 comma string 1, and we'll pass a set of other strings as well. I'll say string 2, string 3. What will happen? What is happening now is mandatory parameter is matched against this. So 25 becomes mandatory parameter. String 1 is mapped against default parameter. And the string 2 and string 3 you can see are in the args tuple. You can typically use args when you want your API consumer to be able to pass multiple values. So over here, he can either pass 2 values, he can pass more number of values as well, right? So let's say he wants to pass 4 values, string 4, string 5. Now you'd see that you would have args having 4 different values. So star args here allows you to pass any number of parameters. So you can pass the arguments, 1 argument, 10 arguments, 15 arguments. They would match against this and you can use them in your method as a tuple. Take a pause here, and in the next step, let's look at keyword arguments. Until then, bye-bye.